Whence and whither liberalism? We have an account in Alexander Dugin of the heredity of liberalism out of the medieval dispute over the supersensual universal, with respect especially to William of Ockham, who was a kind of academic in the University of Paris, his head full of all kinds of difficulties raised by innumerable thinkers, in contradistinction to a monastic or somebody speaking only to the inner chamber of the heart. So I'm going to contrast the nominalist account briefly with a second account, and then I'm going to make a larger distinction between the metaphysics prior to the Enlightenment and the Newtonian metaphysics with their heart in the Galilean inertial frame of reference. First of all, let me make a statement which of course only says something which is quite familiar to most students of these problems, but we'll just raise it up to our consciousness at the moment. The great English scholar of China, who's widely recognized in China as a great scholar of Chinese things, Joseph Needham, has said of Eurocentrism that its fundamental error is the tacit postulate that modern science and technology, which took hold in Renaissance era Europe, is universal, and that it follows that all that is European is. The simplest version of that is that Newtonian generalizations, such as Newton's giving more exactitude to the old concepts of space, of time, but also of of the new concept of the inertial frame of reference, and correspondingly to mass and to the all-important in physics concept of force, present generalizations, not just generalizations, but universalizations, which are only broken down due to the inability of the so-called theory of everything to arise, because there's special or cut-out theories, the special theory of relativity, for instance, which can't cover the whole, and therefore you don't have a simple universal theory, but the aim is universal. Whereas in all thinking prior to this claim that the light has come through Mr. Newton, so for instance, very pertinent to what we're talking about, John Locke has said in his famous essay concerning human understanding, which is still read by students of political philosophy regularly, my admiration at the surprising inventions of this great man carries me to conceive of him as a person who not only must raise the glory of the country which gave him birth, but that he has even done honor to human nature. So there's a universalizing sentiment, by having extended the greatest and most noble of our faculties, reason, to subjects which, till he attempted them, appeared to be wholly beyond the reach of our limited capacities. He's setting himself next to Newton. The incomparable Mr. Newton. Next to him, I am an under-laborer employed in clearing the ground and removing some of the rubbish that lies in the way of knowledge. So I think that's strong statements by Locke, who Dugan presents as the father of liberalism. We can find much stronger contrast in Hobbes. In Hobbes, we see that the principle of inertia has straightforwardly been taken as the principle of comprehending human life. So Hobbes says human beings, the imagination of human beings works just like the physical laws. There's been a total leveling. So if you think of Nietzsche's statement about the cardinal differences between the kinds breaking down, the total leveling consists of process, force, being modes of human thinking, space and time, and the mathematical imagination being the main mode of human thinking understood by the Newtonian orthodoxy. So we can remember that many people have revolted in some way against the Newtonian metaphysics. So, for instance, Berkeley's essay on freedom in mathematics and mathematical thinking, and many other small revolts have been made against this metaphysics of Newton. On the whole, of course, we know this nature and nature's laws lay hid. This Alexander Pope, great poetic revealing of Newton as the bringer of the light out of the darkness of the Middle Ages. God said, let Newton be, and there was light. So we see there's a mythological element in the rising of Enlightenment metaphysics out of the Aristotelian world, which used concepts like substance and accident, and discussed the same questions which were, broadly speaking, discussed by the ancients, rather than, and I should say more largely, which believed in things, or objects, or however you want to call them, which believed in kinds and individuals. So it's unimportant when we think in the terms that we've been bred into, to question the questions that Aristotle and Plato questions. Our categories are the categories that are fit for the inertial frame of reference for the exactitude of calculation of processes, of how things happen rather than what they are, and also not regarding things as having their center in themselves, but regarding everything as being part of a process which can be measured and calculated. So Hobbes thinks of human beings in this way, and he talks about the life as being this emission of power after power that ceaseth only in death. So power meaning possibility, potentiality being unrolled, unfurrowed. So we have totally different categories, metaphysical categories, out of Newtonian thinking, especially out of the Principia, but out of other writings too, than we did with the Aristotelian thinking. Of course, there's many figures involved, and it's larger than that, but Newton is seemingly the most celebrated figure of this mythology of the Aufklärung, of the luminaires, the illumination of the world. Freude, joy, schön, Gottesfunken, beautiful, divine spark. All this imagery is still full of talk of the divine being at this time. We can see during the 18th century, and it cools during the 19th century, when it's realized that we can't get to anything human out of the phenomena, especially as it's more and more being regarded as a process rather than as anything involving a purpose, in the sense that it was taken for granted by the ancients that rain falls in order to create flora, to produce the grain on the earth. Whereas by the modern metaphysics, you can only say that the rain falls because there's been a process happening in the cloud mass. You can't say that it did it because it was supposed to. Questions, when we go into the questions of nominalism and the question of what is self-evident. So Willem of Ockham never said the thing about which he's often quoted as saying about the multiplying entities or anything like that, but what he said was we shouldn't say things that aren't either self-evident. In other words, I look and I see a bench, or I look and I see a kind of thing that's self-evident, or things that we don't have direct reason for claiming to be so. So because apparently Willem of Ockham is, according to the Catholics, he's viewed as a conceptualist rather than a nominalist in the full sense. But basically the issue of this dispute they're having is only about the universal, and it's not about the idea. The idea is assumed to persist in the mind of God, and the question is only what access do we have to it, what kind of scientific access. And then the idea is that the universal is supersensual. It's not available to the senses, but it's part of our knowledge. And then there's all these kind of questions along the lines of that question, which you only get a slight hint at in classical Athenian thought, the notion of Socrates. If you know what Socrates looks like, how is it that you can possibly make a mistake and take somebody else for Socrates? How can a mistake happen in knowledge? This kind of question raises the slightest bit of the issue, which today is one of the central issues of thinking of the so-called epistemology, or question of knowledge or science, because we have to know, is our direct intuition or understanding of things reliable, and in which way could it be unreliable? So for instance, that it's totally founded in the particular kind of organism we are, so that if we're a spider, we have a different access to whatever the object is than we do as having a human body. And then Kant takes that to the highest plane, even raising the problem of perception to the level of the philosophic categories. And this kind of question, which plays no role in the pre-Enlightenment thinking, or very little. So we have basically the metaphysics in antiquity, which is a plenum of truth. Everything is assumed to be intelligible and to be here for us. And then we have this metaphysics which of the supreme doubt of Descartes, and made to be positive through the Newtonian metaphysics and through this project, which seems to have been put on our shoulders as someone has analogized this, or made a metaphor of a father with their newborn child who's somewhat embarrassed or unsure how to handle the child, but has realized that this is permeating and extending into their whole life in a mysterious way, and that this is somehow their this is something that involves them in the same way this Newtonian thinking has befallen all kinds of people of the kind that have cited. So now let me give a passage from Bertrand Russell to show the way the modern view is looking around the year 1900 or a little after the year 1900 to the proponents of the one side of this Verdertiles strike, this judgment question, this question of value judgments, as against the other side. So about the year 1900, what happens is, and a little before, you have these waves of the so-called Verdertiles strike, or the value judgment dispute, whereby the question then becomes, how much can we put on ordinary human notions of right and wrong and so forth. And then you get this plays a huge role in economic thinking, which if we're not really aware of this fact-value distinction as it arises out of Nietzsche into Weber and these other people who bring forth this situation out of which you can then have a dispute between logical positivists on one side and Frankfurt School on the other side, or between earlier on between some economists in certain situations. How this arises becomes a more acute, and if we understand that, then we can understand how we slid into this situation where it's unclear what the purpose is. So nobody knows what the purpose of the country is. They just cite making more jobs for some reason, as though that made the slightest bit of sense. Because in the medieval period, the purpose of economics, so far as it was thought of, was to provision human beings with the material things they needed. It would have made absolutely no sense to say we're trying to employ people just for the sake of employing them. If anything, we would try not to employ people, to give them total freedom. Of course, that's somewhat vexed by reality, you could say, because Calvinism comes in and the wealthy people say, look at how the poor live. They're not industrious enough. They need to be whipped into shape. They need to be told to be more responsible, and so on and so forth. But all these, there's many folds to this. But okay, let's just look at the basic juxtaposition through a look at Russell, and then through a look at Dante, who speaks for the medieval period.